Good evening, guys. Hopefully everything is going well there. I'm giving just a second for people to jump into the session too, if they're just getting in. I also just wanted to check to see if the video feed was getting audio, and so that looks like it's working well too. So welcome to my office. You can see the baseball theme here going on with the Cardinal stuff going on in the background, as well as other baseball things too. This is where my review sessions typically happen. This is usually a moment where my fantasy football teams have either gone well or not well. You can see tonight my team, Teddy Roosevelt, is doing pretty good. And so it looks like I'll get a victory this weekend, and so I'm in a good mood and hoping that you guys are doing all right too. So with the review session this evening, I've stalled a little bit to give people a chance to get in. This link will be available to you not just tonight, but in the future too. So this will be archived on my YouTube stream, and then also I've put it into the Schoology folder for the night before test reviews. So hopefully if you need to access it again, or else if you're somebody who's got activities tonight and you need to dip into them later, hopefully you've got a resource that's helpful for you. So what I'll be doing this evening is I'll just be taking a look through the questions that you've got posted inside the Schoology discussion that I had set up for you this week. I'm betting, since the four sections can't see each other's questions, that there might be some redundancies, and if there are, then I'll just make sure to filter them out. Also, use that discussion feed if you want to repost any questions, or else if you've got questions you need to do follow-ups, feel free to post those there as well. So I'll run through the list, make sure that everything is answered, and then we'll wrap up our session for tonight. One of the questions that I had, though, on my Schoology messaging was a question from one of your classmates that was asking about the curve that's set up for your tests. And so when you come to class tomorrow, bring a Chromebook charged, ready to go. And then what's going to be happening is you'll be taking your test. It's a 50-question multiple choice test. It's not going to be stimulus based, so it's not going to have like a quote to start off with and then a bunch of questions that go along with it like the AP test does. But instead what's going to be happening is that you will have 50 questions. They're just content questions to make sure you know your content well, asking you a specific question, asking you for a specific answer out of 4 choices. The curve is set to 44, so if you score over a 44, you will be getting more than 100% on your test. These test questions are kind of nitpicky, and so for you guys, when you're thinking through how do you prepare for the test, thinking about the green review book or those end of chapter quizzes are a really great way to go ahead and get ready for the test. Also keep in mind that for you guys, the test tomorrow is going to be weighted a little bit lighter than all the other tests you'll be taking this year, strictly from the standpoint that you don't know what you're getting into yet. And so if tomorrow doesn't work out well, we don't want to ding your grade and then put together with your physical geography test. Hopefully those two things put together make sure that your grade is all right, and then we start building from there to get you to a better place. So I'm starting with the questions that were posted for period 5 because that's the first one that pops up in Schoology. So question number 1 was, what made the Incas so famous? Just how big were they as a civilization? They were rivaling the size of the Aztecs, but the Aztecs were bigger. And the thing that made the Incas so important was they were a very important civilization, the most advanced at the time that the Spanish arrived. And they were sitting on a gigantic deposit of silver that's going to become very important for the Columbian Exchange. The Spanish will take that silver and export it back to Spain, but then they also start trading very extensively with China through the Philippines, and so they'll have a gigantic Columbian Exchange taking place from Spain through America to China, and they become a global influence during that period from Columbus's arrival up until the Spanish Armada. Let me see here. Who was Oliver Cromwell? Oliver Cromwell is going to become much more important when you take world history. He's in our class. He's important from the standpoint that he is going to be a person who interrupts the string of kings and queens. He is going to be a person who takes over control of the government. He is a Puritan prime minister, and he takes control of the government for a period of time until he is removed from office. For us, what we need to notice with all the monarchs for the test tomorrow, it's very rare that I'll ask you about a specific king or queen per se. Closest to it could be like the Glorious Revolution and the impact it had on like the Dominion of New England. The key thing, though, is noticing that as you have a new monarch, as we have like a Puritan take control of England, that's going to cause a lot of religious upheaval, and it could cause a push factor for people to want to leave England, or in cases of European changes of monarchs, they might want to look someplace else to find opportunities. How did the Protestant Reformation impact colonization? What you should be seeing is there's a battle going on between the Catholics and the Protestants to see who can win over in Europe. That's why Spain's exploring the New World. They do want to deliver the G of God to people who are living over in the Americas, but that's much less important than them getting their hands on a lot of gold that they can then use to dominate Europe and reestablish the idea of it being a Catholic continent. On the other hand, Protestant countries are doing the same, where they're trying to fight a war with the Spanish, and resources from America will help them out with that. One of the questions that was posted by one of your classmates is a key term that we need to be using from this point forward, and the term is mercantilism. So mercantilism is the idea that the colonies are being established by the mother countries for the purpose of making money for the mother country. So when you think about mercantilism, the whole purpose of the colonies over here in America is not for them to be self-sustaining. They want to have colonies over here that are sending raw materials back to Europe, and then those raw materials can then be turned into finished products that the English or the Spanish or the French could sell, and they'd like to sell them back to the colonists so that they're dependent on the mother country. So even if they do get money, they're hoping to take most of it out by buying the good stuff that they want to get from Europe. So that's what mercantilism is about, and that's what the colonies are very much established for the purpose of doing. Also, the thing you should notice with the Protestant Reformation is many people who are traveling to the Americas are being caught up in the issues of the Protestant Reformation, whether it's Quakers who want to flee, or Puritans who want to flee, Pilgrims who want to flee, Catholics who are looking for a haven. You see a number of places over in America where there's a desire to escape persecution, and that's what's drawing a lot of people over. The next question for period 5 is asking, what's the difference between Puritans and Pilgrims? So when we think about the Pilgrims, they're the first ones to America, and remember, they're known as our separatists. So they're the ones who are splitting away from the Church of England. They go to Holland, and then they move to America to retain their cultural heritage, and they land in Plymouth. They settle. William Bradford is their leader. They create the Mayflower Compact. They are going to be fighting against their neighboring Native American groups, but they do make alliances, and they get help from Squanto. On the other hand, the Puritans are people who tried to stay in the Church of England, and a decade after the Pilgrims came in 1630, they're facing persecution from the King of England, and so they decided to come here to America and form Massachusetts Bay as a city on a hill, as John Winthrop envisioned. Both of them are Calvinists. The difference is how they reacted to the Anglican Church during the English Reformation. The next question says, to explain a little bit about Native American groups like the Aztecs and Powhatan and how they affected the colonization of the Spanish and Europeans in the New World. So when we think about the Aztecs are going to be the ones encountered by Cortez. They have a large culture, but they are very much damaged by disease and European weapons, and the fact that the Europeans are able to form alliances with their neighbors. So while there's a large resistance that's possible, there's a number of things that undermine the Aztecs, and when we see the Aztecs fall, other Native American groups will also be susceptible then, because most of them are smaller than what the Aztecs have set up. The Powhatan are going to be a similar sort of situation that you see with next to Jamestown. There are two Anglo-Powhatan wars. And initially, the Native Americans are interested in trade, but they're suspicious about the colonists. And then eventually, when they try to root them out, disease and European weapons, and also just the overwhelming number of Europeans in that case who are coming over, are going to be able to dominate the Powhatan and take them over. Let me see here. Can I explain the purpose of the slave codes and the Barbados slave code? The whole purpose of the slave codes is to figure out how to have a group of workers like African slaves, and trying to figure out ways to dominate them, even though the African slaves are much more in the majority of the population than the white people who are the plantation owners. So with the Barbados codes, they are very much built in ways to try to anticipate how people might resist and rebel, and then make those things very dangerous to do, because they could lead to severe punishments of the slaves who are trying to do those sorts of things. So they are the traditional slave codes that you've heard of in your textbooks in like middle school, where slaves are not allowed to read or write or travel freely. They're held against their will for both their lifetimes and their kids and their grandkids. And so they're very much meant to keep the African slaves as a group that is constantly under watch, so they can't become rebellious. Meg's question that I see next is, what is the difference between Calvinism, the Puritans, and the separatist beliefs? The best way to understand that is men and women are both human beings. And so when we take a look at Calvinism, that would be like the human being facet of that, where Puritans and Pilgrims are all part of the Calvinistic faith, where they believe John Calvin's view of predestination and the idea that you should have a conversion experience. The only difference is the Puritans want to purify the Anglican Church while they're still in England, and the Pilgrims try to go on a pilgrimage to separate themselves, and eventually they end up in the same area over here in the Americas. Let me see here. Can I give more examples of salutary neglect? Sure. So with each of the colony groupings, what you should notice is in their day-to-day lives, they are allowed to make pretty much every decision on their own, where they're allowed to figure out what roads to build, what stuff to plant. They're allowed to decide what church they're going to go to. So as far as the King of England making any of those decisions, the King of England is largely stepping back and allowing the colonists to govern themselves, except for in really major issues or during those short windows of time, like you saw during the Dominion of New England, where he takes away more control and then they become rebellious. With salutary neglect, then, the colonists are paying taxes, but they're paying them to their own legislatures, and the legislatures themselves are doing things to make their colony better, which means the colonists are independent and self-sustaining. And this is going to become then the thing that is going to make colonists eventually mad, is they're going to have a century and a half of largely governing themselves. And then once that's taken away after the French and Indian War in chapters 5 and 6, that'll lead to our revolution. And so the colonists, while they are technically English subjects, the best way to think about the colonists is that they are all the people who don't fit into England the way that it's configured right now. When they get an ocean away from England, they like the idea of being able to take care of themselves, and they grow very used to that during the period of salutary neglect. So I don't see any more questions for period 5, but I will return to that period in just a little bit to see if somebody types something in. The next question I see, after the Columbian Exchange, what was the main reasons why European countries went from a feudalist to a capitalist society? And also, can you explain mercantilism? So mercantilism we've already satisfied. The transition from feudal to capitalistic is a bigger picture movement that's taking place during the time period that we've got colonization. So the way to picture feudalism is, think about a feudal lord being somebody who has a title, who controls a castle and perhaps a church, and they are the owner of land that all of the people in the area living on that land are essentially his property. They're his serfs or his servants. In this time period, this is the period of the Black Plagues, if you've heard about that in previous classes, where you've got these plagues where rodents are covered with fleas that have this disease that is causing people to get sick. It's the reason why they have the song Ring Around the Rosie from the time period, where they sing Ring Around the Rosie, which means that there's a ring around a pink scar that you end up with, or a blister or bruise, that shows that you've got the Black Plague. Pocket full of posies is what they were using as one of the techniques to try to ward off the disease. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. People are dropping dead. So we have a massive Black Plague that is sweeping through Europe and is killing a lot of people. And what starts happening is a lot of the people who are on the feudal lords' lands, the people who have skills start realizing their skills are marketable. If they're a blacksmith, they realize they can go to pretty much any other plantation and possibly make more money. And so you have some serfs who start moving within England. You also have feudal lords who realize that they got way more people living on their land than they would prefer. And so many of them are getting shoved off the land, and they're now being forced to fend for themselves. And they're now shopping their labor as best they can, trying to find jobs. And many people are less worried about trying to help out these workers and more are trying to figure out how to make as much money as they can, which is leading to a rise of capitalism. You have classes that are emerging, a middle class is growing. They're putting pressure on the king and queen because they're becoming much more powerful. And so we're finding this is a period of change from feudalism to capitalism. What we'll find, though, is that at the same time period, this is where mercantilism comes into play, where each of these countries sees America as a safety valve, where whether it's England or America or France, if you want to start sending people to colonies to take care of your excess people, you're capable of doing that. And then that solves two problems. Number one, they might discover wealth that they could send back to their mother country, or else secondarily, you're at least getting rid of the troublemakers who are causing you problems, and they can be then sent off somewhere else. Problem with America is it's going to get filled with troublemakers to the point where they're going to be strong enough to actually win a war against the British, and that's where you're coming up with our American Revolution eventually. The next question says, even after Europeans came to the New World, did Native Americans still have matrilineal cultures? They did. Also, in Chapter 1, it says that Europeans first brought malaria with them to the New World, and then later indentured servants coming from Europe got malaria. So the thing that I want you to think about, and it's a great question that you're asking because it's totally a legit thing. And so this is where we take your geography course and we peel it apart to give you the freedom and capability of using that in the future. With Europe being a continent of gigantic size, the people who are coming to America who are delivering malaria here are delivering it from areas in England and other places that are susceptible to malaria. Not every place in England and Europe, though, is a malaria zone. So while you have some people migrate to America early on in Jamestown that deliver malaria, and then what happens is the mosquitoes in the Virginia and southern areas, they bite the person, they then start growing malaria in their guts, and it's going to be something that becomes endemic down there. So anybody who encounters these mosquitoes who aren't resistant are going to be then getting bitten and going through that seasoning process we discussed. As you have later waves of people coming over from Europe, you're going to have many people coming from regions in Europe that aren't malaria zones, and so when they arrive here, this will be their first exposure, and then they go through the problems that you were seeing in the textbook. So it's a really good read, asking for that clarification, but that's how you're ending up with people in waves, still generations afterwards, still going through that disease process when they arrive in the Chesapeake. Let me see here. We already covered what is the difference between separatists and Puritans. The next question is, will we need to know the dates that the colonies were founded? Are there any dates that are a need to know? Okay, so the easiest ones to point out to you is think about the period packets that I've given to you. 1492 is crucial with Columbus. 1607 is the establishment of Jamestown. In smaller context, 1588 with the Spanish Armada is useful for both this year and next year with World, but I don't see that as a vital thing. The two major colony groups are going to be Virginia and Massachusetts, though. And so when you think about Massachusetts, knowing that Pilgrims came in 1620, but especially the Great Puritan Migration of 1630 is pretty vital when you're thinking about exact dates. Afterwards, though, the only thing that I would really encourage you to think about is notice that the later colonies came after those moments. Georgia coming the latest in the 1700s. But for the remainder of the dates that you have in your textbook, unless I'm overlooking a specific event, you're thinking more chronologically what came first, what came later as your important thing. So understanding that in Massachusetts, you have John Winthrop, City on a Hill. They're starting these town councils and townships that have public education at Harvard University. And then later on, they have, at the end of the 1600s, the Halfway Covenant and the Salem witch trials. That's a good place to be. Same thing when you're talking about the Chesapeake, knowing they go through starving time first, then they introduce tobacco at the end of starving time after 1610, 1611. That's where you're having tobacco arrive. And then understanding later during that century, you have Bacon's Rebellion, which is causing the colonists to rethink indentured servitude and go instead completely with African slavery to replace that workforce, and you'll be in a pretty good spot. So hopefully that answers that for you. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to be kind of vague when it comes to those sorts of answers because There may be some dates that pop up that I'm forgetting about, but the way this test works is not like in what year did Bacon's Rebellion happen in a list of 4 years. That's just trivia. And so we're assuming that you're getting a level of chronological reasoning where you're developing an eye to see this came first, this came later, this came after that, and that'll serve you well. Let me see here. I'm now moving on to period 4. And it looks like we have the same question. What specific dates do we need to memorize? And so hopefully you're satisfied with the answer you just saw. It says, can I please explain more on the Spanish and the Muslims' relationship? And so really that is going to be something that is not going to be heavily important for either our test or the AP test itself, other than the fact that with the Muslims, you're going to have a series of war called the Crusades in the Middle East, where the Pope is encouraging Catholics to go into the Middle East and root the Muslims out of places like Jerusalem to regain the Holy Lands. That's going to inspire the Spanish to start moving towards establishing trade routes with China and trying to find a westward passage, and that's where Columbus comes in. You're also going to see that eventually the African Moors are going to move into Spain and conquer the country for a period of time, making it a Muslim nation until they're overthrown by Ferdinand and Isabella. By merging two families in marriage, they're able to form a nation state, and that strength is able to drive off the African Moors. And what you're going to see is from that point forward, a dedication of the 3 Gs, gold, God, and glory, spreading the Catholic faith. But then also you'll notice that during that period from 1492 until the establishment of Jamestown, there is no problem that the Spanish have of using African slaves. And part of the reason why they're doing that is they see many of them as either being pagan in the jungles of Africa, or else they recognize that many of them are Muslims. And they very much don't have a problem with capturing them and using them against their will as workers, and also trying to convert them to Catholicism. Although if that doesn't work out, they will still use them as slave labor, because that gold portion of gold, God, and glory is by far the most important for the Spanish. Let me see here. Do we need to know the Spanish conquerors from Chapter 1 name by name? Not most of them. If you see somebody who is very notable, like a Hernan Cortez with the Aztecs or a Columbus, those are ones that move beyond just a laundry list of names of people who are doing the same thing. Can I explain the Puritan work ethic? Absolutely. So what you're going to have with the Puritan work ethic is you're going to have a viewpoint that they have up in Massachusetts. It's a viewpoint in Massachusetts that God likes those who help themselves. And God helps those who help themselves. And so the viewpoint is God would not let anybody into heaven who is practicing any of the deadly sins, like being slothful and lazy. And so the feeling is that if you're being a good Christian, you are working all the time to make the best out of what you can do here on earth, but then also you're doing the best you can to help out other people. And so that Protestant work ethic is going to be something that is very much a huge element of how Puritans see themselves as worshiping God. The next question says, what is the Congregational Church? And what you'll notice is with the Puritans, they would be considered a Congregational church. So instead of having a pope that runs everything, they're going to have a congregation in a specific town, and they're largely going to govern themselves. If they have religious questions, they're going to read their Bible and interpret for themselves what the interpretation of God's will should be in each individual situation. And that's why you have things like the Salem witch trials, where when you have a hysteria break out, you could have one town that all of a sudden melts down completely because of the fact that they've been overwhelmed by their emotions rather than being reasonable. Let me see here. Harrison, hopefully you've been able to log on. The next question I see here is period 4. What was the Dominion of New England? So what you should notice is as we moved through the 1600s, in the late 1600s, there was a movement to grant charters to Rhode Island, to Connecticut, and then in the time period where we had a movement away to a Catholic leadership over in Europe, in England, the decision was made to take not just Massachusetts and leave them alone, but they took Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, all the way down to New York and New Jersey, and they put them into one clump called the Dominion of New England. And that was something that was governed by Edmund Andros, who was sent over as a royal governor, and it wiped out all the colonial charters that these colonies had. It wiped out the idea that Massachusetts was unique and a city on a hill. And so as a result, the colonists become very angry at losing their autonomy, because when the Dominion of New England is created, you see for a period of time salutary neglect is ended. The king is now no longer neglecting the colonies. He is now stepping in and trying to force them to behave in a way so that they're not nearly as radical and independent as they have been in the past. Instead of being satisfied with that, you notice that there's a lot of people who are trying to push back, who are trying to resist. You learn in Chapter 4 about Jacob Leisler and Leisler's rebellion, where he's actually in a full-blown rebellion that goes awfully wrong for him to try to push back. And then eventually, when you have the Glorious Revolution with William and Mary, two Protestants who come from the Netherlands and they then take over the English crown, they're able to reintroduce Protestant leadership. They then give back colonial charters to the colonies. But at this point, the Massachusetts charter is going to not be for the purpose of being a city on a hill. It'll be a royal colony governed by the governor, by the king himself through a governor. But they will go back to then practicing salutary neglect and largely leave the colonists alone. Let me turn to period 6. How come Native Americans were getting sick from European diseases, but Europeans weren't getting sick from Native American diseases? This was the awful exchange that was taking place with the Columbian Exchange, and it's a really good pickup that you have. The key thing to think about with the Europeans is there was much more close living in really tight quarters in urban areas in a place like a London or the other major towns in England. And so as a result, for the Native Americans, since they're living in wide open places far distant from one another, you don't have the sorts of mass epidemic diseases because of that whole situation of space. There's not enough people to breed that sort of problem, and because they're practicing agriculture and nomadic, but they're not practicing with a huge amount of livestock, the things that are causing the diseases are multifaceted. First of all, you've got Europeans bringing over diseases like smallpox, chickenpox, flu, cold, that sort of stuff that the Indians had not encountered. Secondarily, what's being brought over is stuff like malaria, where somebody will bring it, it will then go into the mosquitoes, and that will create a brand new way of delivering diseases. And malaria hasn't been something that has been a huge issue here like it had been over in Europe or over in Africa. Thirdly, they're bringing over livestock, and like pigs and other critters can bring along stuff like anthrax and other sorts of really terrible diseases. So all three of these are doing massive amounts of damage to the Native Americans. By contrast, for the Native Americans, the only disease they really find that's uniquely here in the Americas that gets transmitted is syphilis, which is a venereal disease. So it's a sexually transmitted disease, which is uncomfortable and can be fatal. But it's a very specialized way of transmission, which means that it's not going to cause widespread epidemics that will clean out the entire population in the ways that all of these diseases that the Europeans are bringing over. Let me see here. Will the test have different sections per chapter, or will questions from all chapters be in random order? Gotcha. So really good question to ask. The way that the questions are going to be put together is you will have questions 1 through 50. They will be roughly in the order that they pop up in the textbook. The questions will be in the order, but the answers will be randomized. So each of you will have a very different test from one another, where all the multiple choice test questions will be scrambled. Not the questions, the options, the ones you choose from A through D. So if you look at a neighbor's test and you try to compare notes, or if you try to memorize the order of them to like pass on to a friend, every test will be different in that fashion, even though the questions will be in the same order. Let me see here. The next question, what was the Glorious Revolution? So the Glorious Revolution was the war, the transfer that took place where they replaced the Catholic King of England with William and Mary, a Protestant couple from the Netherlands who come over and they move to England, and they're allowed to move into the monarchy. Even though they're from a different country, they're Protestants and they're from royal blood, and so they're allowed to take over the English throne to try to reintroduce a Protestant faith because there were many people who were unhappy about the Catholics being in control of the monarchy at that point. Let me hit refresh and see if there are any other questions that have popped up. I know this is super in general, but can you explain the big differences we need to know between the middle, southern, and northern colonies, and what? Okay, so first of all, when it comes to regional differences between the colonies, there's the Chesapeake colony, and so the elements that you learn about for Virginia are going to be what's essential to understand about them, because that's going to be very much what Maryland adopts as well. And it's going to be what influences the plantation-style structure you see to the south. So in Virginia, you have a headright system where people are allowed to bring over workers, and when they bring over workers, they get to add 50 acres of land per worker that they bring over to their plantations. They will be growing tobacco. They have a House of Burgesses. They have a very rigid class system where you're upper class or else you're lower class, and then obviously the slave class is even lower still. Up in New England, we see instead of like Virginia, where you have individuals coming over to Virginia, you have whole families or whole towns who are making the trip over. And when they're coming over, they're trying to create a city on a hill up in Massachusetts. And a lot of what Massachusetts is up to is going to influence what's going on in Rhode Island and Connecticut and their environment, because it's got rocky soil and colder temperatures. Instead of just growing tobacco, they're going to grow a diverse number of different things, whether it's subsistence crops, and subsistence means they're growing just the food that they're going to be eating. You also have fishermen up there, shipbuilders, timber is huge. They've built cities for trade like Boston. And then what you see with the middle colonies is they're kind of a hybrid of those two groupings. But in particular, what you're going to see is oftentimes they're built for specific purposes, like New York for trade, created by the Dutch, or Pennsylvania as a haven for Quakers. But remember, those are our bread colonies, where they're providing the food for the North and the South to be able to do their things while also still getting access to grain that's being grown in those colonies as well. So hopefully that answers the question about what's going on with different colonies and how Virginia and Massachusetts are important. So let me quickly scan through and see if there are any other questions that have popped up. So we already covered Puritans and Separatists. What English kings and queens are important to understand. There's not going to be a heavy influence of like English kings and queens on your test as far as asking, did this monarch do whatever? You should notice that the Protestant Reformation in England was caused by Henry VIII. You should notice also that Elizabeth I is the one who's going to really start pushing for the idea of getting involved in colonization, and then you'll eventually see that taking place with James I. But as far as what you should notice with the monarchs, notice instead that when new monarchs emerge, oftentimes they can create push factors with a religious change that's going to cause tensions back in England that might cause movement. Let me see here. I believe we covered salutary neglect and the people of Pennsylvania with the Quakers. Let me see here. Next question. But did many immigrants die on the passage from Europe to North America, and was having to cross the Atlantic Ocean a deterrent to those who wanted to immigrate? Yes, both of those things are really good points to bring up. Lots of people died on the passage over. It was really rough to come over. And for a lot of people, that was a deterrent for them to come over, but they were leaving a place that was pretty hostile. And so many people were willing to risk it because things were so dire back in England during that time period. Why did the Puritans immigrate to America if they were trying to purify the church? In 1630, they were getting pressure from the king because the king had turned on them and he didn't like having the Puritans there. Let me see here. Commonalities between the three colonies. I think we just covered that one pretty well, but hopefully you can ask any questions if you want. Why is the Mason-Dixon line important? The key thing to pay attention there is, by a fluke, that difference between Maryland and Pennsylvania is roughly, it's first of all where we see a divide between northern and southern colonies. So Maryland south are going to be the slave colonies, and north from Pennsylvania is going to be places that easily move away from slavery when it goes out of fashion. But also south of that line is where you see the first environments that are really tolerable for malaria. And so you're going to see a lot of people dying of that south of that line, where north of that line they're not going to be susceptible. Did it go okay tonight?
Yeah.
Good? You win?
No, I broke my ankle.
Did you hurt yourself?
Yes.
Okay. Are you okay now?
Yes.
Okay. My boy just got home from 3-on-3, so I had to check in. Let me see here. How's the curve and the test work? I believe I covered that one, so hopefully you guys are good. Could I explain what role the New England Confederation had in the development of modern-day America? You had a defensive pact that was created between the New England states where they decided they would defend themselves against Native Americans by banding together. You're going to see something similar to that in the colonies when they unite in the American Revolution, especially under the Declaration. And then with our Constitution, you see that even further. Let me see here. So I believe I am done with period 6, so I'm going to cycle through my other classes here really quickly. Oh, I see one more here. Could you explain what the House of Burgesses is? It's a legislature. So in Virginia, they're going to be creating a legislature where they're creating laws about how the Virginia colony is going to run, and they're electing people from the plantation class will become the leaders of the House of Burgesses. So people who own plantations will end up in the House of Burgesses. But instead of waiting for the King of England or the royal governor to tell them what to do, instead the House of Burgesses will make decisions for the colony themselves on issues that they're allowed to decide about. So where to build roads, where to build a port, what to do with taxation, how to protect against Indians or the Spanish. So they get to have self-government and make decisions on their own. Let's see what other questions I've got going on here. Will we have to know all the founders of the 13 colonies? No. But it's best to have an idea of what's going on with them. If they were a royal colony, or else if they're a group of like religious people coming over, there are specific stories that are specific to the individuals, like James Oglethorpe starting Georgia for Poor People, or Lord Baltimore coming over, or absolutely John Winthrop with his City on a Hill. So there's a good number of those individuals that could show up as test items. But we're looking for more big picture stuff than just, can you tell me which colony James Oglethorpe made? So it could be put into there as a part of the clue or part of the answer, but it probably won't be just the focus of the question. Why did the natives near Jamestown begin the Second Anglo-Powhatan War if they were in a truce with those who settled in Jamestown? The Powhatan leader who formed that truce passed away, and one of his rivals took control of the tribe, and he had never felt that it was a good idea to make a truce, especially given the fact that the Jamestown colony kept growing and growing. And so there's a feeling that the Jamestown colony was going to overwhelm the natives, especially since they would allow their livestock to run through the fields and destroy the Three Sisters crops. And if the natives attacked any of those animals, it could lead to a battle or a war. There was a lot of tensions that were going on between the two. And so the Second Anglo-Powhatan War was the feeling that if they don't do something now, then Jamestown's going to get too big. And so they felt pretty desperate about that. Let me see here. We did the House of Burgesses. Can I explain Leeser's Rebellion? That was something I explained in the video lecture that was released on Friday. And in particular, it was really simple. Jacob Leeser wanted to fight back against the Dominion of New England, and so he rebelled and was able to take control of New York for a bit of time. The problem was when the British sent over ships to America, he attacked them, not realizing that they were being sent not by the Catholic leadership, but instead by William and Mary, the new Protestant leadership. But Jacob Leeser was later put on trial. He was condemned to death, so he was hung by his neck. He was then split down the stomach, and all his arms and legs were attached to 4 different horses. So he was drawn and quartered. Then they burned his entrails, so that would be a demonstration that you don't do this to the king. And then they discovered he was on their team, so he was pardoned. So he had that going for him, but he was totally dead. And so with Jacob Leisler, he's a great example of when salutary neglect was threatened, people would protest in minor sorts of ways, all the way up to the point where they would like physically rebel to try to battle back against the taking away of their rights. So let me see, that's period 2. Check period 4 to see if anything new has popped up. What are the freedom dues and what is the middle passage? Freedom dues is the payment that's required to be able to get your freedom. So it's pretty much like the title says. The middle passage is part of the triangular trade, and it's the passage from Africa to the Americas, delivering slaves here. How many short answers will be on the test? Tomorrow's just straight a multiple choice test. There are no short answers. We'll be doing some more writing again on Tuesday when I introduce you to the process of how do you do a long answer essay question in a DBQ. And then on Wednesday, we'll be diving into Chapter 5, and then shortly afterwards into Chapter 6. So let me see. I don't see anything more for period. Let me scan up here. I don't see anything more for period 4. Check with period 5. So what were the Pilgrim colonies called? That was Plymouth, and then Plymouth was eventually absorbed by Massachusetts shortly after its creation. Noah's question about are there answers for the Green Review book, you should look inside the American Pageant Resources folder, and you'll find that there's answer keys for both the end of chapter quizzes and then also for your Green book. What is feudalism? We covered that at the beginning of the review session with the idea that feudalism is the system where you have feudal lords who are controlling chunks of land, and then the people who are on their land are their property, or they're known as serfs. And so that's a system that was set up prior to when the epidemics came through with the Black Plague. People started moving pretty freely, and then we moved to a different system following that. What is the Stono Rebellion? That was an attempted rebellion by slaves in the South, and it's one of the instances that convinces Southerners that they should be thinking about embracing the Barbados slave codes to make it harder and harder for people to be rebellious. And part of the reason why the Barbados slave codes come in is because they're fearful of slaves, but then they're also really nervous about the practice where they would use African slaves initially as indentured servants, but then they became very suspicious about what would happen if you had a growing African populace inside the United States that might behave kind of like the indentured servants did with Bacon's Rebellion. And so that's why you see a tightening of those slave codes following the Stono Rebellion especially. Let me see. Can I explain the Salem witch trials more? Pretty straightforward. In Salem, you had people who were very much angry and nervous about the changing world they were in. They'd experienced the Dominion of New England. They had witnessed people in their community acting strangely. So we don't know if there was like a rot that was going on inside their grain that might have caused hallucinations or a mass hysteria that was going on. But there was a belief that there were witches in their midst. And with Salem, the community got so scared that they actually allowed the use of spectral evidence, which meant that you could claim that you were being tormented by somebody, and all you had to do was claim that you were seeing their spirits attacking you, and that would then be credible in a court of law. So there were people who were killed because of the fact that that was enough evidence for them to be convicted. That witch trial also has got a weird dynamic to it where you had people moving in new to Salem while you had some people who'd been there for a while. And one side of town were the accusers, the other side were the ones being accused. And so we see that this might have been an example of what we call nativism, where we have people who are very nervous about immigrants or newcomers, and as a result might react hostilely as a backlash against them. Why did the dethronement of Catholic James II lead to the Glorious Revolution disintegrate the Dominion of New England if Puritans were somehow Protestant? Okay, so James II was trying to crack down on the Protestants that were in New York, New Jersey, and all the way up through New England. So when the Catholic leadership was removed by Protestants, the Protestants weren't nearly as fearful about what's going on with New York, New Jersey, and the New England colonies. And in particular, they understood that the colonists were willing to go all the way up to the level of rebelling against this new Dominion of New England, which wasn't collecting the revenues they wanted to, and they had people protesting. So that's why shortly afterwards, with William and Mary, they disintegrated the Dominion of New England and returned the colonies to being their own individual groups, because that seemed to function and work better. What set the stage for the discovery of the New World? You had the motivation push factors going on with like the desire for spice trade and other sorts of resources from Asia and the search for a Western Passage. You also had a number of factors going on in Europe with like the Renaissance that was beginning to emerge, and a push against the Catholic Church, which allowed the reintroduction of scientific thought in ways that hadn't been happening for centuries in Europe. Let's see here. What made the colonies so special, or what were the things they contributed? We discussed how they were the bread colonies, and they each have unique, different origin stories. What is the topic we should study most for the test tomorrow? I don't even know how to answer that question. You're studying chapters 1 through 4, so there isn't you should study this most. It's making sure you've understood that chapter well, and you can test on the whole of it. Can I talk about Bacon's Rebellion? That simply was Nathaniel Bacon being an individual who was being frozen out of leadership in the Chesapeake, and he was angry about it. So he was able to take the anger that indentured servants and runaway slaves had about Indians on the western frontier, and he was able to turn that into a revolutionary effort where they all got together and attacked Jamestown. They were on the verge of burning the place down, and then Bacon died because of disease. And as a result, the Bacon's Rebellion fell apart. The decision was made that indentured servants were kind of scary, and so there was a feeling that they should stop using them as their normal workforce, and instead they start really turning towards African slaves at that point as a way to bring in a group that they could permanently control, without having a group of free individuals who are angry about being at the bottom of the system. Instead, you'll have them under captive control, especially with the use of the Barbados slave codes. So let me see if we've got any other questions that have popped up in the last few minutes. So let me see here. When should Chapter 6 notes be done? Chapter 5 and 6 are going to be both this week. So our schedule is pretty simple. Monday is our test. Tuesday we take our second physical geography test, and then we also will be working on essay writing at that time. Wednesday we start studying Chapter 5, and then we'll transition into Chapter 6 on Thursday. So tomorrow night, when you finish up with your test, you should start reading Chapter 5, and then hopefully on Tuesday night, you can get done with another chunk that gets you pretty close to being done with the chapter. Let me take a look at the other classes and see if there's anything else that I'm going to take care of. Let me see here. Was the headright system used to decrease the amount of indentured slaves? Opposite. And so what's going to be happening is they're going to be using the headright system to encourage plantation owners to bring over as many workers as possible to fill up the Jamestown colony, because that'll provide defenses against the Native Americans. But then also it will allow the creation of a lot of tobacco that will make the colony very wealthy. And so that's the reason why they're allowing each plantation owner to get 50 additional acres for each worker they bring in. Take a look here and see if anything new has popped up for anybody else. From what I've seen, let me see here. Were the 4 teenage girls in the Salem witch trials the first ones claiming to have seen witches, or the first ones accused of being witches? Good question. I'm not certain. What you have is Tituba, who is hanging around with the girls, and they all are claiming to be involved in spiritualism and witchcraft and whatever, as far as like claiming to see witches and being around them, and then they start throwing around radical accusations at people. But I'm not certain. That's a detail that I don't know. From what I've seen, what's the best study technique? Hopefully your reading is done. Hopefully your notes are done. The best way to get prepared for a test like the one that you have tomorrow is you've got your green study guide and your end of chapter quizzes. If you've not done those yet, this would be a really good time for you to complete those quizzes without any notes in front of you to see what it is you've actually retained. If you find any of those questions are ones that you got wrong, you can take a look at the end of chapter quizzes, and there are rejoinders for each of the question sets. So it will not just tell you what you got right or wrong, but it'll explain to you why the right or wrong answers are what they are. But if you find you get a question wrong, you shouldn't take the test over and over again until you get perfection, because all you're doing is memorizing the order of the options. Instead, if you find that there are any problem areas, that's where you really should dive into studying tonight and tomorrow to make sure that you get those areas cleaned up so that you're safe for the test that you're taking tomorrow. Let me see if anybody else has posted any other questions. All right, guys, I don't see any other questions for this evening. So best of luck tonight, first of all. And also, please keep things in perspective. This is the first time you're taking one of my tests. And so, again, this is weighted softer than any of the other tests you're going to be taking this year. And then at this point, you are somebody who did your summer work. You did the best that you could at that point. And you probably have a bunch of ideas now about what you would probably do differently based on how you've seen my class run. With your next test that you'll be taking in class. And so that's just our motivation, is when you move on, you just figure out what your next study method is going to be, and you appropriately adjust what you're up to. Also keep in mind, we throw out one test per quarter, and this is totally the reason why. So if you feel tonight that you're not feeling 100% solid about where you want to be, this will be the time to be able to make any mistakes you're going to make, and then as we move forward, you and I can be working together to talk about strategies that will work out better as well. So at this point, I'm going to wrap up your review session. But remember, this is going to be archived on YouTube, and then also it's going to be archived on your Schoology page. So if you need to check back and rewatch anything, feel free. I wish you the best of luck tomorrow when you come to class. You'll drop off your notebook on my desk when you walk in. If you're doing electronic notes, I will at that time have an electronic drop box for chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 notes. They'll each be individual submissions, so if you've got one document that has all of them, you'll just be submitting it 4 times in class to each of the different spots for your 4 chapters, so you get credit for each of them. Good luck tonight. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully this has helped you out somewhat, but I will see you tomorrow.